the first pasuk that said that the limbs and the fats of the burnt offering are put on the mizbeach, and they burn throughout the night, and it concludes Eish HaMizbeach Tukad Bo, and the fire of the mizbeach should continuously burn. So over here, the Baal HaTurim explains. He says, HaKarbonos Nikru Isha. We find that Karbonos refer to Isha. Why are they called Isha? From the word Eish. Because they're consumed by fire. But Torah Nikras Eish. And the Torah is referred to Eish. Shenemar quotes a pasuk in Yirmiyah, Halo kol dvarei k'eish num Hashem. My words are like fire. We find in Zos HaBrocha, Mimino Eish Das Lomo. From his right, Eish Das Lomo. Das Lomo. The words, those two words, Das Lomo. Das means the religion, the belief. Lomo means forever. Talmud. If you combine the two words, it spells the word Talmud. HaKarbonos Nikru Lechem. It says Mimino Eish. From his to his right is fire. So Talmud is Eish. The word Das Lomo together spells the word Talmud. HaKarbonos Nikru Lechem. The Karbonos are called Lechem, as it says, what we read on Rosh Chodesh, the reading, as Karbani Lachmi, the Korban, which is my bread. Torah Nikras Lechem. And it's also referred to Lechem, a pasuk in Mishlei, L'chu Lachmu B'Lachmi. You should engage in my Lechem. Kashem She'efshar L'olam B'lo Lechem. Just as bread is the staple of life, the world can't exist without bread. Kachiyefshar L'olam B'lo Torah. So we find there is a commonality. Just as one is a necessity in the physical sense, the other is a necessity in the spiritual sense, and the physical is only sustained due to the spiritual. The Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin that Lo Ivri Leilo Elo Legirsa. Why did God create night? The reason why God created nighttime, so people should study Torah. And one time, people lived in agricultural society. People worked from dawn to dusk. At nighttime, they weren't able to work any longer out in the fields. So what would they do? So nighttime was for sleeping. However, for a Jew, the nighttime is Legirsa. Girsa means to study Torah, to review and study. So why did God create nighttime? Legirsa. The Ramban writes at the beginning of Parshas Bereishis, an animal's behavior is dictated by what? Based on its DNA. It's everything is instinctive behavior. An animal cannot behave differently than its mathematical. The human being has choice, and we're able to do many things despite instincts. We can override instincts, or we don't have the instincts. For instance, an animal only procreates when it's in heat. A human being is able to engage in procreation whenever he chooses to procreate. The Gemara says in Be'ah that certain species only procreate during the daytime. Other species only procreate during the nighttime period. So the Gemara says something interesting. A species which procreates at nighttime, it would always give birth at nighttime. The species that procreates during the daytime only will only give birth or lay the egg during the daytime period. A human being who could engage in procreation day or night, a human being could be born either day or nighttime. It's based on that, because procreation is based on one's choice, one to, one not. An animal, a living species, it's not based on what it wants, but rather the way it's programmed. So the Ramban writes that if a human being, if there would be light 24 hours a day, a human being very often has to be stopped in his tracks. Because if you let him go the way he chooses to go, he'll work himself to death. At nighttime comes, he's forced to stop working. As much as he wants to work beyond the daylight period, he's not able to. So the night forces him to stop and to sleep or do other things which are not as labor intensive as working the agriculture or the working the farm, the animals. So the Gemara says that the winter rains bring the spring and summer crops, that the earth is saturated with water, or the snow of the winter allows the crops to grow during the what? During the spring and the summer. The winter time, the nights are longer than than from spring going forward. The days are longer. So when does a Jew have more time to study? In the winter. And the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, below Mosif Yosef, that a person who doesn't add to his study in the summer, when summer ends, Yosef, he's held accountable, he's culpable. Was here, now night is coming during the summertime period when it's light, longer. You have a reason why you didn't study. You have to engage in what? In your agricultural involvements, in your livelihood. But when winter comes, when the days are shorter, so what's the excuse not to study Torah? So therefore, if a person doesn't have a legitimate excuse, there's a claim against him. So when do we study longer hours? We study longer hours in the winter. Now we refer to that Torah is nifshel lamayim. Torah is equated to water. As we said, in many ways, water is the source of life. What causes the crops to grow in the spring and summer? The winter rains. When do we study Torah longer hours? In the winter. Because God created the night to study Torah. So we find, just as he's saying, the carbon is called lechem. The Torah is called lechem, as the world cannot exist without bread, because that's a staple. The Torah cannot exist without Torah, because that's a staple of existence. That's the purpose of existence. Just as the world cannot exist without water, and the rains of the winter provide life in the spring and summer, because that's the basis for all growth, agricultural growth, identically, what's the corresponding factor which allows the world to continue? That's the Torah, which is studied in the winter. We study longer hours because it's also called Mayim, which also sustains existence. So we find this parallel. He explains, B'derech Remes, Tirmus Kal Parsha Golus Achron Shanu Bo. He says, on an illusionary level, this parsha alludes to the last exile, which we're experiencing now. The Nachmenu B'itzu Nafshenu. It's to console us because of all the angst and all the disappointments we have, called Kalish. Maneh Hinochem Nafsho Bros Orach HaGolus. We're denied any level of respite because we see the length of this Golus, of this exile. Nira Lemidome, Lemitzrayim, Ches, Tov, Bavalayan. Egypt was 400, relatively speaking. Only if you count from the birth of Yitzhak. Bavel was 70. L'shneim Yachad Tov Ayin. Ve'eda Yom Elef B'Tov Reish Beis. Ayin Beis, he says, the Or Chaim is writing, it's 1,672 years since the Churban HaBayis. The Or Chaim is writing this. Today it's even a lot longer. My Yachalot, what's there to hope for? Golus Levad El Ida Umos. It's not only that we're displaced, what about how we're afflicted by the nations of the world, how we're downtrodden? Kikol Goy Mamloch Bnei Yisrael Yavodu. The Jews scattered throughout the world were subject to the enslavement of the world. The Jews at the mercy of the world. Yisoviv Choshuv Lotov. And brings about that good things. He says, truth is no longer spoken. And now the tongue of falsehood is prevalent. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees from the beginning to the end, he understands exactly where this is all going. Everything that happens is for a reason. Ultimately, the destination, we're going to arrive at the destination. He's telling Moshe to give encouragement to Klal Yisrael, despite the lengthy golus, to put in perspective. Rosha Midei Torah, Sifsei Kohen, Asher Torah Yivakshu Mipiu. The first people he's addressing are the B'nai Torah, people who have a Torah perspective, that they are the ones who give foresight to inform the future generations what we're experiencing and what the value is. Zos Torah Sa'ola. This is on the illusionary level. Oma Zos Lamai Tolalios. Shei Kamoa Ola. You hear this? This is the ultimate level of advancement, of elevation. V'chozo Pirish Mizos. Oma Hi Ha'ola Kvarksiv. Mizos Ola Min Abidbar. Al Moktok Al Mizbeach. Beis Protum Shalom Behem. He says, the Pasuk speaks about Al Mokta Al Mizbeach. The Mokta is the bar of wood, the bear of wood, Al Mizbeach, on the altar. Torah, we have B'nai Torah which doesn't exist among other nations. This element. We're subject to suffering in this exile, suffering and impoverishment. The Jews were always discriminated. They couldn't engage in certain areas of commerce, certain professions they were kept out of. Keneged Torah, Omar al Mokto. The Torah is referred to the Mokto. Shenim Shla Torah Leish. The Torah is compared to fire. Timtso Shamozal. Quotes the more in Tainus that if you see a Tzumar Rabbanon that's a budding Talmud Chochem, a well-weathered Talmud Chochem, Ritzcho Doraisa Rosel, he has the fire of Torah burning within him. You know, just to mention what the Chofetz Chaim says, you know, on Shabbos, we didn't get to the laws of Bishul yet, but we speak about a Kli Rishon, a Kli Sheni. What is a Kli Rishon? A Kli Rishon is the vessel that was on the fire, and the walls of the vessel are hot because it absorbed the fire, the heat from the fire. What happens if you take a Kli Rishon and you remove it from the fire, and you leave it off, and it's slightly warm? Although it's a Kli Rishon and the remnant of heat is due to the fire, but that heat doesn't cook any longer, because since the heat cooled down, although the source of that heat that still exists is from the fire, it's no longer Kli Rishon. It no longer cooks. And that's the halacha, right? Even if you take a pot of water off the fire, leave it off the fire long enough, and it's no longer Yatzel Letisbo, it will not cook. Even though originally it was a Kli Rishon, and the heat, the remnant of heat is from the fire. So he says, we just quoted a Pasuk, what is a Talmud Chochem? Code variation of Hashem. Because the Talmud Chochem contains the Torah, he's the fire. The person who's associated with the Talmud Chochem, he becomes the Kli Rishon. But when does the Kli Rishon retain its status of Kli Rishon? Only because of the proximity and the association of the vessel on the ongoing basis to the fire. So the Talmud Chacham himself, who possesses the Torah, he is the fire. But the person who's not that Talmud Chacham, what keeps him attached, what keeps him warm and vibrant within spirituality? It's his proximity, his relation with the Talmud Chacham. But what happens if he detaches himself from the Talmud Chacham? Even though at one time he had a relationship, but if that attachment is over a period of time, eventually it starts vaporizing. It starts drying up. And there's only a trace of it. But that trace is not enough that he has the status of a Kli Rishon, because that connection no longer exists. Okay? That's the Chofetz Chaim. So a person who's not a Talmud Chacham, what's key and essential? Your relationship with the person who's the Talmud Chacham, because he's the fire. That's how you keep vibrant, and that's how you keep in touch with, although you don't have the knowledge, but you have the sense because of your association with the person, which is the source, which is the fire itself. That's the Chofetz Chaim. So the fire is what Eish Tukad Bo is referring to the Talmud Chacham. That's the Torah. What's the Golus? The exile. That's Alam Mizbeach. That's the altar. We're all on the altar. Meaning you want to use it in the vernacular. We're all on the chopping block. We're all on the chopping block. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Tshuva that today that we no longer have a Beis Hamikdash, what's the Mizbach Kapara? What's the Mizbeach of atonement? He says Tshuva. And he speaks about the various levels of transgressions, what you need, that the Tshuva should reinstate us, should atone. So the Mizbeach is Kapara. Chen b'loshen hachachomim v'odia kosev ki memtzos beis dvorim tieno al yosenu miuedes ba'aflogs meulos meshunos the shevach shvochim ashlohoy v'loyer. What we're experiencing today, because of the lengthy exile, the Jewish people are elevated and advanced to a level that the previous generations didn't have, because of this lengthy suffering. Despite our detachment, we still have people who study Torah. So the people who represent the Torah and the rest of us who suffer and who are denied, who are discriminated against, it says, Ola, this elevates us, this advances us. How long do we have to endure this? That we're on the Mizbeach. We're on the Mizbeach, which is actually suffering. Yisurim. It's a lengthy night. Quotes a posuk, Shomer mami lailo. Chen posuk lini halaylo. Doshu zal ala golus. Stay overnight. The nighttime always represents golus, exile, araboker. You have to be in this state until morning. When Hashem will expose us to his glory, that's boker. That's already morning. The sun is rising. Vazmanu achar avar tovkuf le'elef hashishi shekodem lanu medivreim ki yomo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu elef shono. Mehaskel yetovkuf rishono midas lailo tuvkuf shnio midas yom. Vodia Hashem ki ad boker ki shigmo tovkuf shono begolus ad boker shialio. Rabbi Koh speaks about exactly, it's unclear when it will end. So here he writes, not getting involved, he writes, the Eish Mizbech Tukad Bo, the fire of the Mizbech will burn. Yodia Kosev Kibora Boker, Tashin Af Hashem. When morning comes, the anger of God will actually seethe. God will take revenge against the nations of the world, what they did to us throughout history. Veishmi Piv Tochal Asher Inunu B'nei Avlo, Visrunu Bisuring Nekomo, Ubefrat b'nei Marav hapnimi. She'ein locha kos marsh l'timu tomit. Hear this? He's referring to the Arabs. B'nei Marav. I'm not sure, maybe he says. The Western world. V'omru eish tukad she'ramaznu bo b'chinas ha'yisur me'umos. V'richem libam l'asher hiko Hashem ze yomim v'yishvul gon Yaakov. The nations of the world afflicted the Jews without any level of mercy, and they lowered the glory of Yaakov. Lo noag ben bechinas diron. Eish mezech tukat ki nelam nelomim. He will wear the cloak of what? Of vengeance. Just to end it in a few moments. The Kohen will wear his midovad, his linen vestment, yirtzal midas chesed v'rachmim. Ki iskane b'shem Kohen. This is alluding that to the attribute of rachmim and chesed. Hakavonish kamachasodim yaskimu lintkom nokom. Even the midas chesed will agree that the nations should be avenged. I'm a shibrash in Parshas Ba'ero. V'yoma elo b'ani Hashem. Mido vad yisparo derech omrom ki kol nefesh horgu umas b'Yisrael akidu shmo. Now this is very important. This has to do right now. He's quoting the Medrash in Tehillim called Nefesh horgu umas olam b'Yisrael akidu Hashem. Any Jew who died al kiddush Hashem throughout history, HaKadosh Baruch Hu roshem midomo tzuras hanerag hu b'malbush v'osa yilbosh yom nokom b'libo. Hear this? There's a halacha, when the Jew's buried, we prepare a person for burial. There's a ritual. If God forbid a Jew dies, is killed, he's buried with the clothing, with the blood on those clothing. Why? Because when God will take revenge against the world and avenge the suffering of the Jews, he's quoting the Medrash in Tehillim, God will have that garment on him to show the evidence to avenge the death of all the Jews who were killed al Kiddush Hashem. You understand? So all the victims of the Holocaust, the pogroms, the Chmelnytsky, whatever it is throughout history, the Romans who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. You read Josephus, the way they murdered and butchered the Jews, the Crusades. Hashem will come and have every garment that every Jew, which has his blood on it, he will, with wearing that garment, whatever that means in the spiritual world, he will avenge the life of every Jew that was taken al Kiddush Hashem, because he was killed because he was a Jew. Asher heim am bodol lishkon b'shoshem bad. Gam yirmos ha'achtus shem nerogim kol asher liachutzu l'shantiv shem shemaim dover acher. And why were they killed? They were killed because they weren't willing to accept the shituf, meaning the Trinity, which is Christianity, to accept any other deed, any other power other than Hashem. Shehorgu umos me'anoshim v'nigoshim el Hashem, hamachnisim emunas Hashem v'achdusha b'leiv Yisrael, v'mikiri ke'el elyon, asher ein dover mavsik bein levenom. When he's saying, it's also referring to the Talmud Chacham, who's the one, it's interesting, the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, the first people they hunted were the rabbis. The communists, at the time of the revolution, the first ones they wanted to destroy were the ones represented religion. Those were the Rosh Hashivas, the rabbis, because they were the influencers. Hashem says, those are the first he's going to avenge. He's going to avenge the death of these people who they killed. And then he will avenge the lives of all the other Jews who will kill HaKadosh Hashem. Okay?